Okay, John, we are live.
Are you sure?
Yep.
I don't see the notification yet. Okay, there. Now we're live. All right. Welcome everyone to the Jordan Peterson community podcast session. What we do is every week we kind of go over the lectures of Jordan B. Peterson and discuss them, and then what we're doing now is kind of a uh, discussion about the discussions that we've had. Now, because both Sumit and I have been, I don't know, not weren't able to really go through our discussions today. Is going to be a little bit more informal and a little bit more haphazard because um, I don't know. My main takeaways from this week. So we were discussing the lectures that we went through were Jordan B. Peterson's Maps of Meaning series. So this week was the final, the 12th, the 12th lecture of his biblical series. Whoa, is that you or me?
Sorry, that's me. I fixed it.
Okay. His biblical series as well as his Maps of Meaning series. So, uh, as I don't know, for myself, I think the Maps of Meaning lecture carried a lot more weight and a lot more, uh, di- a lot of different points that I think are worth honing in on. So I'm going to be emphasizing that more so than the biblical lecture, because I don't know, because for myself, it's kind of the accumulation of everything that he's said previous to it, and even the biblical lecture is kind of built off of this Maps of Meaning series that he's done. So, um, okay, two, I guess, things that I want to point out to begin with, and apologies for uh, neither of our video screens going. Right now, I'm on mobile, so I'm trying to get as much data that sounds clear for everyone, and uh, that means removing the video. So, okay, so I wanted to start off with the big points. I think that this lecture really deals with, where Peterson had that kind of infamous debate with Sam Harris on the uh, question of what is truth. And through watching this lecture, I kind of realized where Peterson faulted in his argument, or at least why he kind of failed the debate. Because I don't know, as you can kind of tell by the end of it, Peterson was the first one to kind of bow out, and I think the point in time when he actually did that is very crucial to understand why. Because Peterson got to that point where he was too tired to really go further. But I think what caused him to hit that point was definitely what a great point that Sam Harris brought up, where in order to have a subjective model of truth, which is pragmatism, where everything that we know is based upon our subjective experience of that truth. And he Sam Harris brings up the great point that there has to be some other model or some other label for what we define as objectively truth, something that's outside of our subjective realm that our subjective realm kind of takes in and has to deal with, because that's what pragmatism is it's dealing with the whatever is in the objective, or it's not just pragmatism, it's how as a pragmatic species we uh, how we deal with the objective world. We define it through pragmatic means, and we utilize it in that method. Now, for the postmodernists, there is nothing outside of the subjective. There is no objective truth trying to work its way in. And from the scientific method, there's only the objective truth. And all subjectivity is kind of an illusion that's been brought from that objective truth. So that's kind of the materialist standpoint. And I think this lecture, it really is his finest work. I think it really kind of, you have to really come in with that frame of mind to figure out all these different problems that he's kind of addressing all at once. But I do think he's able to deal with that in a pretty fantastic way. And so as I go through, I have a lot of different notes here, and so I'm going to have to go through most of them, and I'll try to uh, go through it quickly. I'm sorry, Sumi, have you watched the lecture?
I only seen the Bible one.
Okay, the Bible one. Okay, so we can go over that first, I suppose, if you want to, since you're only going to be here for an hour, so we can go through that. That way you can participate.
Yeah, okay. So the thing about Bible lecture is that I finally understood, or at least experienced, what Cain meant when he said his punishment is too great to bear. So, in the previous lecture, you have written the Lord's story, um,
Mm-hmm.
where you have said that he allowed little sins in his life to go unchecked.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't major or shocking kinds of sins, just little sins. But they were
Mm-hmm.
steadily eroding his moral character until finally the sordid incident recorded here burst the dam.
Yeah.
That I was able to relate to that because um, over the course of say last 10 years, I have done things that I shouldn't do, and I have failed the things to I have failed to do the things that I should do. And these have been very small things like waking up on time, reading when you're supposed to read, and stuff like that. Being disciplined
Mm-hmm.
about things, and if you have dreams, then actually seriously taking them really seriously and pursuing them, and not letting the weaker self take over.
Mm-hmm.
So if you make those mistakes over a course of long duration of time, uh, you end up killing your own ideal. So you end up kind of killing the Adam that was inside you. Sorry, the Abel inside you. So uh,
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel comfortable facing the past version of me because I feel like I let him down by making all those small errors and not making the sacrifices that were needed. I kind of compromised my own ideal, which would be able, and now I find myself in a situation where I would have to make enormous sacrifices if I want to set the whole thing right. So, and in that sense, I could relate that. That punishment is like too great to bear because it's much better to make small sacrifices every day rather
Mm-hmm.
than have those things build up and then the dam breaks and now you have to deal with this enormous thing and then you have to think about we have to cut our losses and maybe we will you have to choose whether you have to go left or right and because you cannot do both anymore now and uh, uh, just to sort yourself out in a situation like that it just uh, it's too hard on you to you know uh, now make those kind of enormous sacrifices. So now I don't know what to do about that, but that's just what I realized.
Yeah. I definitely see where you're coming from because just recently I'm going through a very similar thing where I've kind of come to the realization that through listening to a lot of Peterson and kind of opening myself up to more of this type of thinking, it's kind of actively harmed myself in a kind of way where it's making me realize just how much I was within a poor living space, and not physical space, but just how I was kind of mentally. And that realization is something that really, it's not something that can be, along with the understanding of where you are at, comes with the responsibility to kind of change that. And even through attempting to change that, you're going to fail, and I have failed quite a bit, and it's always put me into kind of this depressed mood where I've attempted to become my ideal, so able, and I've failed, and that's a continual process that it's 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 very understandable to want to, instead of having some sort of ideal, to remove the ideal so that where I'm at currently is my new basis for what's good. So, and, and especially recently, like I had recently undertaken a attempting to seek out as much responsibility as I could handle, and I tried to take that on and failed. And because of that, as I said, it put me into a depressed state. And funnily enough, I started to read Leo Tolstoy's book that Peterson's recommended, A Confession. And the confession, or A Confession, is kind of all about how Tolstoy has kind of found nihilism within his life and everything that he does. And it's him attempting to try to seek his way out of that nihilism without resorting to suicide. And that was a very strong inclination for a long time, but he had this I guess a feeling of, or an aspect of cowardice within him to not go through with it. And because he intellectually, he had this understanding that the world was meaningless. And so if you were to follow through with that intellectual understanding, then that would mean to commit suicide and kind of prove that theory to be true. And so the only thing that was holding him back was his own kind of frail biological drive to survive, to live. That was the only thing kind of holding him back. And so because of that, he was living in kind of eternal hell because he wanted to exit out of consciousness or exit out of existence. But he was kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. He has this great metaphor that I guess is a Russian kind of proverb where a man is being chased by some sort of beast, and he dives into a well, and he's holding on to just this small branch. And then at the bottom of the well, there's this other beast that's going to eat him if he drops down. And the branch is starting to break. It withers and withers. And inside that branch, there is a little bit of honey that you can kind of distract yourself from both the dragon above and the dragon below just by eating the honey. And he kind of saw the people that are living without nihilism as the people that are kind of eating away at the honey that comes out of the little branch that they're holding on, without realizing that there's a dragon above them and below them, and that the branch is going to break. It's this denial of the mortality that we face. And I guess I should come to the conclusion of the book, but I have to admit it was, by reading by going through the whole book, it's a pretty short one. I wasn't exactly satisfied with his conclusion, but until probably finishing this latest lecture by Peterson, the Maps of Meaning lecture. But his conclusion was that which is very similar to Peterson's, the viewpoint that life is meaningless, and okay, his lifestyle that he had currently what brought him to the conclusion that life was meaningless, because the lifestyle that he had at that point in time was meaningless. So his conclusion was accurate, but it was because he was under the wrong framework. Hold on one second.
Are you on video also?
No, the internet's out, so I'm using my mobile data.
Oh, the internet's out.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, he came to that conclusion that the life that he had previous to that was meaningless, and so he attempted kind of to go through the different religious circles to find which of them had meaning within them, and or at least, yeah, each of the different religious places he went to all asserted that they were the correct ones, but each also with contradicting beliefs within other ones that asserted that they were the correct ones. But they still brought about some sort of meaning towards the individuals within them. But along with that meaning was kind of this dissolution with the facts. And so it really brings it down to this specific problem that if for people to gain meaning, they have to, okay, or at least that it's okay. Yes, okay, yeah. In order for people to gain meaning, they have to kind of become willfully blind to something. Oh, because that's essentially what we're doing as a species. Is we're kind of always ignoring everything that has no importance to us, and continuing on in whatever objective that we have before us. So we see things as tools and as obstacles instead of the objective objects that they're made up out of, the material that they're made up out of. And so the scientific method is kind of it's a method of removing the tool and obstacle aspects of a material thing so as to get an accurate objective representation of that object. Okay, sorry, I went off on a tangent, but and I'm not even going off my notes, so that's a problem.
One thing is, it's not. Let me put it this way: when when you realize that you have killed your own ideal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of what you could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Then just that realization is so shocking.
Yeah.
That you might just say that what's the point of aiming high?
Because you've already failed and there's nothing that you can do to fix the things that you've already not done.
But you could
right?
still chase that and reach certain approximation of what you wanting to achieve in the past.
Yeah.
But you could at the same time it's like that disorder people have when they go into the sea and some shark comes after them and then they don't even go anywhere near it.
So yeah, the fear of the death or the fear of failure is keeping you from attempting to overcome that fear or whatever it is that's in your way.
Yeah, and then what would you do then? Then you would just default back to what Peterson was saying. What is the phrase he uses? expedient. So pursue pleasure, do enjoy life, do
Hmm.
what is expedient.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's the hedonism that Tolstoy saw from the people that were kind of licking away at the honey within the branch. That's just living life and ignoring the impending doom, and just kind of eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
right, and there is another element to it where remember in the Crime and Punishment, this person called Raskolnikov,
Hmm.
he says that just the life itself for him has never really been enough to justify itself. He always needed some sort of higher calling to keep going. Uh,
And when you
and
fail, when you have that higher calling and you and then you fail, that just kind of puts you back into that
but then you
life
can't go
system.
back to the
It's loaded.
hedonistic thing. That's the issue. Then you cannot distract yourself with the honey because uh, if you are that kind of person, then you know that there is something uh, above it and there is something below it. Uh, so what I'm trying to say is it's kind of uh, not like damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. It's just that uh, it's what Christ said that if you now sin knowing what the truth is, then you are a much greater sin than other people.
Hmm.
So once you have an ideal, once you experience it, uh, then you kind of don't have any choice, even if you fail to still keep pursuing it, because uh, then uh, it's the point Peterson makes in this lecture that if you betray even that thing, then your punishment will become even greater than you can bear.
Say that again.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say is, once you have a higher ideal, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you.
What I'm saying is, once you have a higher ideal, and let's just say it's the pursuit of the truth,
Hmm.
then eventually you would come to know that there is a dragon above and there is a dragon below
Yeah.
the well, and then you will not be able to distract yourself with the honey, even if you want to.
Right.
If you still did, then you would still be deceiving yourself.
Yeah.
It's the another and I'm not sure if you understand the Bible example. In the Bible, I think the Christ tells his disciples or the crowd that hey, these are the things that are true, right? And
Hmm.
this is what you ought to do. This is wrong. This is right. And then he says that there will be other people who will be making mistakes, and I'll be uh, I will forgive them. But if you people make the same mistakes, then I have already told you what the right thing is, right? So those people are doing those things unknowingly, so I might forgive them, but you, I will never forgive. So after having known the ideal, and after you have a high aim, then what I'm saying is pursuing it could be painful, and if you are too far out, you would have to make enormous sacrifices to come back to it, uh, and that may be a punishment that is too great for you to make all those sacrifices. They might be unbearable, but uh, just to go back to this hedonistic paradigm that you were talking about, where you are distracting yourself with the honey,
Hmm.
that then becomes even greater crime. uh, that will definitely send you to hell. That's what I think. So in that sense, you kind of don't have any choice.
Hmm.
uh,
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So there's like a little bit of you have more mercy for those that are naive than you do for those that are willfully blind. So there's kind of the idea that a child, they have no real understanding of their actions, but only after they've grown up they should know better. And so if you kind of have gotten to that point where you realize that there's there's something more that you should be doing, and then you fail to follow up with that, and you return back to your hedonistic lifestyle, or you just don't you do not change your actions based off of your new understanding of what you've seen, then that's a failure, not out of naivety, or naivete, it's out of willful blindness.
yeah, exactly right. And in that context, I also understood then that what you were talking about life not having any meaning, because if it doesn't have any meaning, it is such a relief.
Hmm.
Because then you are no longer judged by your own ideals,
Yeah.
and you can just fall back and relax.
Yeah, that's the kind of solution of the modern age, is to, if there is no meaning, then that justifies all action that we take. Or it's not that well, yeah, it kind of justifies. So if there's no meaning, then that means I can do whatever I like, and there's nothing that can be said or done uh, that can change my mind as to what my actions are and whether or not they are moral, I suppose. Not really moral, but what valued.
It's And on top of that, once you arrive at a certain level, then it's difficult for you to go back to the previous one. Uh, what I mean by
Well,
that
you
is,
you
yeah,
can't. Yeah, it's there's this saying by one of the Greek philosophers. Once you step into the same river, you no, it's something to do with like you cannot step into the same river twice, because every time you do it, it's new water. You're a new person. The, through our ever constantly changing world, you can't go back in time to the person you once were. You're always moving downstream, or you're swimming against the stream, or you're everything around you is changing, or you're changing compared to everything around you. There's no stagnation. You can't and you can't go back to where the river previously was. That was a
right,
sidetrack, I guess.
right, right. uh, in that sense, you can't. But what I was trying to say was, let's just say that you have seen meaning
Hmm.
and everything, and then you can't exactly convince yourself that meaning is not there. You might um, you might criticize that. You might say that that meaning was only limited to that context, right? But you can't
Hmm.
exactly then go back and say life doesn't have any meaning, because uh, you have seen it, you have pursued it, and now you have failed terribly, obviously. But it was the same thing, where I used to be scared a lot of other people who were doing violent things, uh,
Hmm.
and but I wanted to fix that, and I kept trying, and uh, now uh, and I used to be scared of this thing. If you stand up for what is right, right, you could end up on like on street, uh,
Mm, yeah.
because everyone could just disavow you. You could get fired, and so if so but once you overcome that, once you develop yourself enough that you do the right thing, even when your survival is at stake, then it's difficult. It's really hard for you to not do that anymore. I mean, you would have to come up with. Then you'd have to come up. You would have to then consciously walk away from the situation. Fear of your own mortality is not going to be that reason anymore uh, for you to not intervene in that situation. So I think similar thing applies to this whole meaning thing, uh, because once you have an ideal, once you pursue it, and once and when you are pursuing your ideal and when you are doing things right, you do experience, the whole experience becomes kind of a metaphysical. Then you have to take it to its end, because if you don't, then uh, you can't exactly fall back to the hedonistic thing. That's what I was trying to say. uh, because you know that there is a more deeper way to live your life once you experience that.
Hmm. And
uh,
you can like attempt to do it through certain justifications. So, like, if you experience something meaningful, you can then attribute that to, say, you were hallucinating, or some sort of uh, dopamine imbalance within your brain kind of caused that. You can define things down to the point where they no longer have that meaning, but you're actively fighting against your own nature by doing so. Because we are beings that require meaning in order to live happily, or at least live meaning. Well, yeah, in order to live a yeah, we're beings that require meaning in order to live properly. That's better, because you can live happily, but you have to be naive or willfully blind to certain truths. Um, or you can be, yeah, or you can avoid that naivety and you can learn all these different truths, but that also sometimes comes to a consequence. Consequently, it ruins your previous method of understanding the world and gaining happiness from the world.
Actually, that reminds me of this thing where seeking truth in itself sometimes can be a tragedy. Because because uh, just learning truths does give you does put on you certain kind of responsibility, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes you might wish you have not discovered a certain truth.
Yeah. So I love this parable within nature that there is of the emergent behavior within an ant colony, where ants will ants each have their own specific kind of role that they're supposed to play in order for the betterment of the colony. And if there's a missing amount of certain, say, ant workers, those that are supposed to go out and carry food, then whatever ants are left that recognize that missing need, that creates kind of a responsibility within those ants that have recognized the problem to take on that new responsibility. So an ant that sees that there's not enough ants going out and getting food, they turn into the type of ant that would have to go out and go get food. Otherwise, the colony dies, and the ant's sense of meaning, in a way, whatever, it's hard to understand how an ant might derive meaning from things, but that's I really believe that that's a similar aspect to how we as humans are intended to live, because we're information foragers. And so whenever we forage enough information and find some sort of missing element, we that creates within us a desire to attempt to fix that missing element, or attempt to reconcile that missing element into something that's useful and beneficial for the whole, for the entire species in a way. And
That's good. That's yeah.
yeah, I know. I love that. Ever since seeing this video by Kurzgesagt, or In a Nutshell is their other title, about that, is it's kind of been always rattling within the back of my head for this kind of like story within nature of how things work that I just love. Shall I go on to maps of meaning?
Yeah, because I don't think I had one more doubt, but I don't think we will resolve it today.
Well, we might during this. Go ahead and bring it up, and I'll see if it's applicable within the notes that I've kind of gathered.
Uh, Once you have compromised your own ideal,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and the just that realization is too much to bear, and uh, then you have a choice to make, uh, John. So should you continue to pursue it, or we already discussed that you can't exactly fall back to the hedonistic lifestyle again. You'll just be screwing with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So then should you perhaps, this thing is also quite painful, should you perhaps downgrade it? uh, because Peterson keeps saying that this whole research on IQ and all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So should you then decide that, okay, maybe I'm not cut out for this, maybe I should downgrade my ideal, right? uh,
Yeah.
so there is that. But then there is a second aspect which, if Tyler was here, he would bring it up, which is that if you truly desire something, right, and if you keep just trying it out, then what is to say that you cannot overcome whatever the heck it is that is standing in your way? Maybe if you pushed enough continuously rather than downgrading your ideal, if your ideal is really high and if you kept pursuing it, who is to say that you will not attain it? I mean, this again goes back, becomes kind of a metaphysics kind of a thing, where
Mm-hmm.
you can't exactly prove it, but this whole uh, there was this uh, there was this story of that 4 minute mile, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh, People thought you couldn't break it anymore, and then this one guy, Roger Bannister, he does break it, and then after that, other guy broke it, and then other guy. So a lot of it could just be about believing that you could attain it and
Yeah.
then
There could be
pursuing
a
it.
mental block. Yeah, a mental block that's kind of withholding you from breaking it, because that mental block is kind of uh, a self-imposed limitation that you know that you're not going to be able to overcome. But if you kind of remove that mental block, then you might accidentally overcome it. So
But John, it's
there's
a
this kind of
dangerous.
yeah.
Just want to finish that. It's a
Uh-huh.
dangerous thing,
Yeah.
what we are talking about, because just want to finish up with this point that
Oh yeah.
that guy Stephen Molyneux, he has got this free
Uh-huh.
domain radio or something. You know him, right?
Yeah.
So he had this interview about IQ, and what he says in that interview is heartbreaking. So you might say that it's a mental block. What I'm saying is, you don't want to give people false hope also. So maybe
Yeah.
they are just not cut out for it. But how do
Yeah.
you
There's
know?
kind of this
How do you know?
great yeah. There's kind of this great almost cliche story about, or not even a story, but just kind of a justification that people use, where if you're 4'3" and your dream is to kind of become a basketball player, that's kind of like, it's a dream that can never become accomplished. So as we have said, there's kind of multiple ways of dealing with that dream. So you can deny your own limitations that for 3, and you can attempt to become the world's greatest basketball player, and you can fail at that and then feel a sense of failure within you because of that, because you were denying reality in order to accomplish your ideal. Then there's sometimes the case where, because you've denied reality enough, you were able to, say, break that 4-minute mile. You've overcome that mental block, and you've accomplished it through your training and everything like that. Now, as for, like, say, for IQ, you can realize that you're not going to be one of the smartest people, or somebody that is going to be as successful because they're not as smart, or they're not as high in intelligent. Another scenario is to change your ideal. So if you're that specific basketball player, you could realize your limitations and then attempt to find a different ideal. Maybe basketball isn't your best. Maybe basketball isn't where you're most suited. Maybe there's certain other things that you're able to achieve and become greater at. Say you have a high talent for playing the piano, and you can become, instead of becoming the world's greatest basketball player, you can hone your attempt at becoming the world's greatest pianist. And I think that same thing can be applied to IQ. If your IQ is, or if your ideal is to become one of the smartest people in your country, or somebody that's able to be extremely successful, but your current limitations, say your IQ and your monetary, not value, but whatever monetary gains you currently have, that's kind of your limiting factor. Then you have to kind of, or you don't have to, you can search out a higher ideal that's within your limited standpoint. So kind of the moral, I guess, of the story of Job is that as limited beings, we are not God. So we're creatures that aren't able to overcome every single hurdle that is in our way, and we can't accomplish the ideal of being God. And that's something that every man kind of has to deal with, that they are not God, and there's things outside of their own control that are at play. And so if that's both in genetics and also in kind of society, that are kind of holding you back from who you would like to be, say if you would like to be God, and kind of keeping you in your current limited state so that you can't overcome that. But let's see. So in the case of wanting to become God, that's not that's not going to be accomplished at all. Over time, like, the singularity kind of comes to this point where the equivalent of God. That's not really something that's applicable to us as a species, because we're not at that point. You can still manifest certain aspects of the ideal that you hold within yourself. And it's not the infinite ideal that we have. The perfect, we can't become absolutely perfect exactly, but we can take on certain qualities of the ideals that we have and become like them in a kind of way. So say Michael Jordan, famous basketball player, is kind of your ideal, your hero that you hold, and you're, say, crippled. You can't become a basketball player, but you can kind of take on certain traits that he had within the field of basketball and apply them to other fields instead of basketball, because you're not going to be exactly like Michael Jordan. You can be the Michael Jordan in the realm of quantum physics, perhaps, or something like that. Because Stephen Hawking, he suffered through uh, ALS, I believe, and kind of became crippled to the point where he couldn't do anything. But because he had a certain uh, inclining towards uh, the realm of, say, physics or astrophysics, he was able to hone that to a point that he's kind of admitted that his muscular dystrophy has given him a lot more time to ponder on specific things than had he not been crippled. So there's certain times where the universe kind of picks out what ideal we're supposed to follow, what ideal we're supposed to manifest. And we can actively try to not let that ideal manifest. We can be like Cain and kind of live in misery. But if we let go of our egocentric idea of what ideal we should manifest is and kind of take on this new ideal, then we can manifest that and still derive meaning from that new ideal that we are working towards now. All right, I'm going to go over, unless you have a response to that, I'll go through my
No, I'm
maps of
just
meaning
speechless
notes.
at your response.
Huh?
I think I am just speechless at your response. I think it was
Oh,
an interesting response.
yeah. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah, we can continue
Uh,
that conversation later on some other day. But
yeah. Well,
I'll think about
I,
your response.
I think a lot of it will be kind of coming up during this as well. So if you have to leave soon, you can, I guess, listen back on it, or if you're still going to be joining, I don't know.
Actually, I have an important call at 10, so whenever it finishes, I can come back in.
Okay, sure.
Hmm.
But yeah, for anybody listening, I do highly recommend the Maps of Meaning lecture series. I really think that's probably Peterson's best work, and it is also kind of the best starting point for anyone interested in his, because it's with 12 different lectures, and then with this final one kind of culminating into his overall. It's basically like every point that he's made before kind of coming together into something that is useful, that is kind of given out. So um I'm going to be going through kind of the notes that I made uh, during the minutes of the lecture, and kind of, it's almost like every 2 minutes I came to some, or I made some sort of note. So starting off at 6 minutes, and I'm not going to say each minute, I'll just go forward continuity. Uh, what perspective of the world is best? Okay, this is where the argument between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, and also Brett Weinstein also really comes into its culmination. So the current scientific viewpoint of the world is
Where are your
the
notes?
material. I have them written down in my notes app. So
Okay, okay.
since yeah,
That's okay.
I'll paste them into the I guess the main document afterwards. I may try to refine them a little bit because they're pretty expansive. Okay, so Peterson comes from the pragmatist point of view, where the only thing that we have currently is the subjective view of the world, whereas the kind of scientific method is, or the scientific map of meaning essentially is, it's coming from the objective world. Say, so the world is made up of all of these different objects, and we as subjective beings kind of use those objects in a Darwinian fashion towards whatever goals we might have, which is usually like to propagate the species, to live happily, to uh, continue outwards and become more and more complex, and uh, become higher creatures, or at least higher in context to comparison from where we were previously, by our own kind of understanding of what we choose to go off of. So, okay, so Peterson's case is that the subjective viewpoint of the world is evolutionarily most profitable because it also tells you how to act within the world. And so that was kind of the age-old problem of trying to derive an ought from an is, because if you look at how everything as it is, that doesn't exactly tell you how it should be, but it will probably tell you where it's going. So if you look at kind of the past history of everything that's happened, you can see where it was before and where it is currently and where it will be going into the future. But that can't exactly tell you if it should go in that direction or it should divert its path into becoming something different. So you could kind of live your entire life living in a box, and if you've lived your entire life in that box, the scientific method will tell you that you're going to continue living in that box. But uh, there's certain our subjective point of view is telling us where we want to go, where we should go outside of that box, even if there's dangers outside the box or whatever. So yes, that seems to be at least my understanding a large distinction between the Newtonian point of view and the not even Darwinian, but it's like the pragmatist point of view, which as a Darwinian species, that's, as pragmatists argue, the only type of viewpoints that we have. So there's what the world is and how we interpret the world according to our subjective viewpoints.
Yeah, but
mhm.
that's the thing. Whenever we don't understand something, we make it part of something. We try to explain it as something else. For
Mhm.
example, earlier they used to have this dualism that human body is a machine, but all of your conscious thought and you know consciousness and all that
Mhm.
is coming from the soul. So if it is coming from the soul, then you can't exactly study it scientifically because it's not material.
Mhm.
And then some other folks came along and they said, "Screw it! Everything can be studied scientifically." And they found out those people who had damage to certain part of the brain, and then that affected their subjective experience. And now we just will make fun of you if you say that. Right.
Mhm.
If you say
Yeah.
those kind of a dualism thing, so perhaps when you say that things are like
Mhm.
what is, science
Mhm.
also tells you what will be or what could be. Uh, they could tell you when a particular eclipse will take place,
Mhm.
and everything. And there are other places where not they are not able to tell. Uh, for example, they might not be able to tell you with absolute certainty what will happen when sun is dying, uh, and or they might not be able to predict weather properly. Like, that's a cliche, right? So, but that's
Mhm.
only because we don't know enough. We don't have, our models are not perfect enough. So when you say, and this is really interesting what you said, that if you lived your entire life in a box, then the expectation is you would continue to live in the box, because everything we know indicate that you would continue to live in that box. And you might say, then the consciousness kind of makes it unpredictable, because out of nowhere you might have this thought that uh, oh, I want to see what is outside this box, right? So
Yeah,
uh, and you might say, oh, then the subjective one is taking over. But to me it could be that that's only because uh, we just don't have enough data to or enough understanding of the world to actually kind of tell you that that would happen.
exactly. Yeah. So from the scientific point of view, at one point the sun revolved around the earth, and that actually maps onto how the biblical point of view was at that time. And then there came to that point where the scientific point of view contradicted with the biblical point of view, which kind of caused this internal struggle between the search for truth. Uh, so the scientific had to remove all religion in order to continue forward on the path for truth that kind of religion started in a kind of way. And so science is in a lot of ways better in certain cases because it removes the subjectivity of truths, that the world appears flat to all individuals with on the plane of Earth. But once you leave that subjective point of view, like say from space, you're able to see that the world is not flat, and so it causes you to see that the previous point of view was a lie, and that you can't no yeah, that the previous point of view was a lie, and so it tends to follow you throw everything else that accompanied that as a lie. So say Newtonian physics turns into Einsteinian physics, which then maybe turns into quantum physics, and then perhaps string theory physics. But that's not even at a point where it can be. So science can only tell you what is currently, and kind of what everything is also not currently. Uh, and science has the point of view that, or yeah, I'm going to keep it as science just because it's kind of a wide enough scope that my arguments are able to kind of fit within that realm, even though science, okay, the scientific worldview, I'll go with that since that's a little bit more accurate, has the non falsifiable method of dealing with things. So Michael Shermer has this great analogy. If somebody tells you that they have an invisible dragon that lives in their garage, you can ask them, okay, well, can I hold the dragon? No, you can't feel the dragon because, well, you just can't feel it. Can I put dust on the floor and see where the dragon walks? No, the dragon is doesn't affect anything around it at all. It's just a dragon and it exists, but you can't prove that it exists at all. And so the skeptical point of view is, okay, if you can't prove it exists, then it has no effect to our reality at all. And so we don't require it anymore. But you have to specify how you're going to prove that something exists based off of how it affects reality. So the scientific method actively, from the start, it removes all subjectivity for proving things to exist. So anything that relies upon a subject in order to prove it to be true, that within the framework of the scientific method is invalid. It's not a useful method for proving anything to be true. And that really falters with the whole realm of psychology, which is kind of a science of the mind, where it's not using the scientific method because it has to take into account how people feel about the certain actions that they're going through, whether or not they're useful. They think that the actions are meaningful to them. That's the thing. Meaning is something that through the scientific method you cannot come to find, because meaning is a directly subjective aspect. So yeah, the scientific method kind of, anything that is non-falsifiable is not worth dealing with. So in the case of what happened prior to the Big Bang, that's something that you can't prove through the scientific method, so it's kind of left up in the air as being not worth thinking about. Or at least, because it's something that we can't prove at all, it's something that we can't theorize. Well, I mean, people do theorize it quite a bit, but it's not something that is valid within the scientific theory. So, like the idea of a multiverse, that's a useful theory for how the universe was occurred, but it's not a valid scientific theory because there's no way to exactly prove it other than we do exist, and then you can extrapolate from there many different things. You can assume that it was a god that created the world. You can assume that we're one of infinite amounts of other universes that were created at some point by whatever it is that the universe is, and then from there. Okay, so, dang it, I'm still going. Okay, that's, I guess, the start to my notes.
Well, there are a couple of issues here, man.
Uh-huh.
You said psychology is more about subjective. Were you talking about kind of psychotherapy? Because psychology is scientific domain. They do have a lot of papers, and they do. If you look at the neuroimaging and stuff, so it's not all subjective. I mean, there is a subjective element to it. Uh, but even then, we can see your emotions. They can actually show your thoughts on that computer screen with those fMRIs.
Yes, but it's not exactly the scientific method, because it's twofold. Psychology is. It's using what we can get from the scientific method as well as from the subjective individual within that we're studying. So you can ask somebody how they're feeling about some sort of, like, you flash an image to somebody while they're connected to an fMRI. It's a picture of a baby, and then there's kind of these cuteness factors that are or a cuteness part of your brain that shows up, and where you feel like that's something to be protected, that's something to be held, that's something cute. And then you correlate that with what was it that the person was feeling when this aspect of their brain flashed, and then it said, "Oh, that was a cute baby. I wanted to pick it up." So it's not exactly the scientific method. It's the scientific method plus the subjective truths that are being taken in as well.
So let me ask you this: how do you make something objective? Like, what is objective truth? Because at the end of the day, it is the human uh, who has this consciousness is looking at that truth, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
So
that was yeah.
I guess you would know its objective truth when more than one when it doesn't matter who the observer is, you see the same, you take the same measurement. Is it something like that?
Yeah, so that was the crux of the Peterson Sam Harris debate, where Peterson was going at it from the point of view that as subjective people, we are unable to have any sort of objective truth. We can only have whatever truth that leads to some sort of goal for us as subjects, or whatever whatever truth is useful in some sort of fashion towards us. Now, sometimes that truth we realize actively works against those goals, and that was the point of Sam Harris, where there has to be some sort of objective truth that is there no matter how we subjectively feel about it. And that was why I think that Jordan Peterson kind of failed at that debate, because he wasn't able to uh, accept that. But watching from this lecture, I realized that this is something that he's able to that he is able to accept, because otherwise he would be just as bad as the postmodernists that he claims to hate, because, or not that he hates, but that he rallies against, is because if he has no sense of objective truth that we subjectively interpret, then he is the equivalent to a postmodernist that there is only the subjective truth. Now, the I think the reason that Peterson did not go through with that he did not continue that debate was he was tired, and in order to make the point that he made in this lecture, it would have taken much longer and possibly not very fruitful with Sam Harris at that point in time, because I think that Peterson's perspective is that there is objective truth and there's subjective truth, and instead of the scientific way of thinking, the subjective truth is of higher importance than the objective truth. The objective truth informs the subjective truth, but the subjective truth that we reside within is of greater importance to us as a species, that we have to give that a higher currency in the frameworks of being than the material objective truths that the universe is made up out of. So within the subjective truth lies our objective understanding of reality, as well as our subjective feelings about reality. So meaning is included within the subjective viewpoint of the world, whereas meaning is not part of the objective viewpoint of the world. And so if you are, this is the same thing as in Tolstoy, if you're a subject that requires some sort of meaning within your life, you have to get away from the objective viewpoint of the world and resort to or place of higher importance the subjective viewpoint of the world, which is a tricky thing, because our subjective viewpoint of the world has been constantly failing. I mean, we brought it up earlier. The subjective viewpoint that the world is flat is incorrect. It's objectively incorrect, but we still kind of exist as subjective people within this flat.
Sorry to stop you. I have to drop off
Yeah.
in like 2 minutes. So
Okay.
I'll ask you a question, and later on I can listen to it. your
Okay.
answer.
Yeah.
So it's weird thing what we are talking about, because there is no objective truth to me, it seems, because there is always uh, you as a person perceiving something
Hmm.
from the world, and if you are no longer there, then this whole question of objective truth doesn't come up, because there is no one to talk about if there is a objective truth or not. uh,
Oh
so
yeah.
so if there is no
Okay.
person, then uh, who is going to even know what objective means? And I've been playing these PS4 games, right? So
Mhm.
in those games, right, those characters are there, and it's like this whole world, uh, which uh, I guess they don't have a consciousness, so I can't say they experience subjective or objective truths,
Mhm.
but let's just say that they do. And you have these really open world games where are all these characters hanging around, interacting with each other and stuff, and it doesn't make sense for those folks to talk about objective truth. What I guess what I'm trying to say is, there what is the objective truth? I mean, at that whole thing is just a kind of hallucination kind of a thing, because not hallucination, it's kind of, how do I say this, it's just that those things, right, they are just activity happening on the processor of the gaming console,
Mhm.
and there are instructions that are already coded uh, by the programmers, right?
Mhm.
And that whole thing comes alive on the monitor. uh, so so what I'm saying is that uh, what what comes up like as this alive experience is different from what the actual truth is, which are just those ones and zeros getting computed. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely get what you're saying. It seems to be kind of the Descartesian kind of I think, therefore I am, and that's putting the subjective as the pinnacle of what the world is, and there's no there. It's true, you can't exactly prove there to be any objective world um, outside of the subjective,
Okay, I
because
gotta go. I gotta go. I listen
yeah,
to it back. Yeah. Okay.
uh because as soon as you're outside, if you're outside the subjective, then you can't prove anything. There's nothing. There's no you, and there's no action of prove. Now, I get. We'll get into this uh, later in my notes, but well, maybe if in case I don't, I guess I better bring it up now. As subjective people, there are things that fight their way into our subjective reality and force us to conform to it. So you can, if you're existing within a delusion, like a hallucinatory state where life is bliss, and then some sort of predator uh, take breaks through and attacks you, you have to suddenly come to terms with this predator that's around you so that you can deal with it now. It's it's an implication of some sort of objective world because of how it intrudes within our normal subjective world. So you can subjectively believe that redheads do not exist because all of your entire life redheads have not existed to you. And then suddenly you go to Ireland and there's this new thing that you haven't you hadn't ever had to deal with at all. And it's it's the implication that there is something outside of your own subjective world that you have to deal with. And that's, in a lot of ways, the extreme version of that is the assumption that there is some sort of God or external figure that is at play within the world, but we cannot prove in any fashion. So it'd be like trying to prove, it'd be like trying to prove that the Earth is globular to a scientist that is currently understanding that the world is flat. There, until you give them the tools to change their mind, they are not going to be capable of doing so. Hold on, I got a notification somewhere. Wait. All right, so back to my notes. There is the possibility, as Descartes and I think others have kind of gone about, that we are all just brains within a jar, or maybe we're just in a jar, and that is some sort of manipulation of that brain to make us think that things appear and disappear. So that these new objects that we're assuming are real life are just somebody in some external world prodding our brain to make us see these new things. So like you could do a similar scenario in our existence, where if you give somebody certain drugs, they're going to get a sense of meaning and a feeling of objective reality until they're off of those drugs again. Like when you're in the dream, you think of it as the real world, unless you're lucid dreaming, until you exit out of that hallucination, out of that dream world. So in order to kind of deal with that, you have to deal with the limitations that you're residing within. You could be a brain within a jar, but as a brain in a jar, there's certain things that give you pain and pleasure, and you have to try to find the best balance between those two in order to be a happy brain in a jar. So that's the kind of understanding of trying to prove a non-falsifiable thing like that. That's a pragmatist solution, is you have to have a certain set of values and then work towards whatever those values are. So you have a value of, I like to be happy. Even if you're a brain in a jar, you have to go about doing whatever it is that the brain is doing, so I guess thinking, to accomplish that goal of being happy. And so it really is our values that we hold, that's what's going to influence our behavior. It's going to, so whatever values that we hold will influence our ought. So if you're within a box and you find extreme pleasure within that box, you're never going to want to escape from that box. But if you're a subject within that box and you came within that box, you're going to break out of that box and then face whatever exterior box you reside within, and then maybe break out of that. It's kind of a continual breaking out of whatever mindset that we're currently within, or whatever objective world that we're currently within, that we have to kind of make do with. All right, so that was my first note, extrapolated on quite a bit, too much. Okay, yes. Scientific method strips subjectivity. And through the scientific method, there are too many facts for us as limited beings to be able to deal with. So we have to find which facts are most valuable to us that we can go about not having to expend unlimited amounts of energy, because that's impossible as limited beings, to come to terms with every single fact. We have to define down the objective world, whatever that is, into whatever is most useful for us. And by doing so, you're losing out on whatever, like Rene Magritte's painting, This Is Not a Pipe. It's a picture of a pipe, and it's not a pipe. It's not an objective, real thing. It's an image of a thing. As subjective beings, we hold images of things in order to deal with the world. So we can think of pipe, and then we don't have to have a physical pipe within our own heads. We have a abstracted down thumbnail of what a pipe is, and then that's okay. That's something that we can use, or that's something that we understand. And that's how we're able to kind of understand as much of the world as we can, or of the universe that we can. And as limited beings, we have to pick and choose whichever facts we know are the most useful. So you can know limitless amounts of facts about cats, but if you're allergic to cats, that's a kind of useless fact. That's a useless collection of facts to hold. It would probably be better to find something of more use, of more utility for you as an individual being to come to terms with. Peterson raises this kind of question, but there seems to be some sort of separate nature between the objective world, the ises, all of the ises, and the ethics for how to exist within the ises. And so that's the divide between philosophy and science as well. And you can try to create philosophy based off of science, but that kind of becomes utilitarian. If you have a philosophy based off of science, and as we kind of pointed out earlier, science through its own method roots out subjectivity for anything that it takes as a valid fact, then you're going to derive from that a philosophy or an ideology that is not taking into account the subjective individuals that hold that philosophy. So, say life is meaningless. That's a philosophy that you hold based off of objective reality that you witness. And because of that philosophy that you have, that puts you into a state of depression and nihilism or hedonism, and actively works against you as a subjective Darwinian creature. Okay. Now, this is probably the best point that was reached after Jonathan Peugeot, Peterson, and Brett Weinstein had their conversation together. At the very end of it, Brett Weinstein took into account that he was a subjective being, and through his own subjective value system, he's holding the scientific viewpoint of the world as the most valuable. And that's because, and this is a great point, through that method, you're able to all other viewpoints of the world. And it's a great point. It's kind of like a almost contradictory, self-contradictory perspective, because if you say that if you as a subjective person say that the objective world is of higher importance because that informs who the subject is and what they're going to be doing and how the world around them behaves, that informs you greatly. Like, if you understand all of the facts about the world, that tells you what you can do to succeed. But it's not necessarily a purely scientific viewpoint of the world, because you're still taking into account what you want to do. And science doesn't exactly tell you what you want to do. You can see that, okay, this part of the brain lights up when they get something that they want. This is a positive part of the brain that sparks dopamine. So you still have to have that subjective feeling. Dopamine is a pleasure circuit. It's not a pain circuit, because science can't tell you what you feel as being pleasurable or what you feel as being painful. Okay. Okay, so Peterson actually uses the scientific method in order to kind of find out which, just as Brett Weinstein said, which method is the best method between communism and the Western society. What are the consequences to these different ideologies, and can you scientifically prove which one is better or which one's worse? And that's the thing. Brett Weinstein's case is it's really a great case, because you can't do this bit just purely off of subjective means. You have to take into account other people's subjective realities, and okay. It's kind of a continual snake biting its own tail, where in order to progress in the world, you have to know as much as you can about the objective world, because that's going to benefit you. But I do think that you're extra benefited by taking into account the subjective world, because it tells you, it's like doing the scientific method, but you're only able to look at things on a two-dimensional plane. You can't see the three-dimensional plane, and so when things pop in and out of existence, then you're going to be ultimately confused, because you have no framework for what happens outside of the two-dimensional plane. There's still that third dimension, which is the subjective plane, and the two correlate. Our subjective world is based off of the objective world. The objective world becomes the objective world becomes constructed by the subjective world. We see within our own minds a building to be built, and then we do so, and that changes the objective world. It's continual yin and yang between the objective and the subjective, and you can't remove one from the other. Okay. In order for it, you can try to create some sort of AI or different creations that are within that try to take into account the objective world as their framework, but it doesn't tell them what they should do. Like, if you're going to teach an AI to play chess, you have to tell it the rules, and you have to tell it, hey, you want to win. That wanting to win is not necessarily part of it. It's creating a subjective fact within the AI's brain. It's creating a value system, and the objective world can't create value systems, it has to be derived from some sort of subjective person saying what value system we should be holding. And depending on what the subjective person is, you're going to get different value systems. All right. Okay, so we were talking about this earlier with Sumit, how the person that you were previously to you, they are the person that you're kind of held accountable for. Like, if you in the past 20 years have been eating a lot of foods, you're going to be fat. And that's not you, the specific present individual, that's accountable for that. It's the past version of yourself. And that past version of yourself kind of aligns with the father archetype, because it's something that you aren't currently, but it's somebody that took into play who you're going to become. And because of that, they've set you up for success, and they've also set you up for failure. And you have to take those limitations and those benefits and attempt to become somebody new. I mean, you don't have to, but you're going to anyway. Just as we mentioned, you're going to become somebody. Like, if 20 years ago you said, I don't care about what I eat, and then 20 years later you become somebody that doesn't like who you are. All right. We exist within constraints, both biological and societal. So yeah, we have the kind of the motherly limitations from our own genetics. That's the material realm that's kind of passed down onto us. That it, even when, let's see, yeah. So through epigenetics and also just through Darwinian gene propagation, you're going to be limited by the person that begat you. And so you're not going to have 3 arms so that you can juggle easier. You have only 2 arms. So you exist inside those constraints. And then there's the kind of societal, or also fatherly, also associated with the father archetype of the world around you. That's external from your. Okay, well, let's see. Who's the past and who's the present external world? Either way, it aligns with a parental archetype. Anything that's external from yourself. So society around you is constantly judging you and shaping your actions to who you are, and you can choose to exist within those judgments, or you can attempt to step out of those judgments and not, like, you can go into stoicism and not take anything that they say to mind. But by doing so, you also make it harder on yourself, because if you're not taking what everybody else is saying into account, then they're not going to be rewarding you because they don't like you. Pragmatically, we only reside within functional or not, and truth is tied to function. That's the objective world that's affecting how we function as a species. But there are certain things that are based upon contextuality between subjects, which depending upon a frame, that causes a thing to be true or not. I think this is a sidestep, and that is not directly related to the subjects that we've talked about. But okay, so there's multiple ways that you can say something is true, or that something is good also. It's all within the specific limitations of whatever value system you have, as well as whatever objective reality system that you have. So if you have 2 tools, one of them is an axe and one of them is a pitchfork, then one of those tools is going to be better for cutting down a tree, and the other is going to be better for picking up hay. And if you use the other tool, then that becomes a bad tool because you had a specific intention for it, and it did not succeed at that intention that you had. So it's not functional. And that's what we do. We find things that are good, useful, and then use the way that we deem fit to them, whatever way that they're used for towards that means. Okay, so here comes the problem with fundamentalism. I existed within for quite a while. Biblical or mythical mindset seems to say that the subjective world is the objective world, and that the earth is flat. Or at least that's how it was, but as soon as that belief system led us to the point of realizing it was no longer the objective world, our frame became God's dead corpse. So yeah, as soon as what we had thought to be true turned out to be false, then we're at a point where we have to deal with that. And we can throw away everything that we've learned before and start afresh. But we're going to be just as susceptible to things that we're going to be throwing away things that have been quite useful towards us. So there's the case that can be made that if you throw away religion, then you lose meaning. But you can still derive a certain amount of meaning from family. If you happen to lose your family, then that kind of brings that problem back to you again. With mortality, that's kind of the problem that you're always faced with. Now, Paul Vanderklay, he's a pastor that goes through Peterson's lectures from a very interesting perspective. He does make a good point that the viewpoint of the Bible as if it is the objective world in reality, that we do reside within it's not just these things, but all of if you believe 100% the Bible to be literally true, all of the things objectively happened within history exactly as it is said in the way that you're thinking that it happened, that we do live on top of a flat earth and all of that. And that's the thing. For myself, I didn't have the flat earth belief, but that is something, if you want to take the Bible as literally true, you kind of have to take that along with it, it seems. Now, Paul Vanderklay brings up a good point that those that have that more naive viewpoint of the objective world still have a higher ranking of the other truths that are within the Bible. I don't know how true that is exactly, because for myself, I seem to have a higher gratitude for the biblical stories when understanding their metaphorical truths that are useful for me in my present day, as well as the possibility, more so than the possibility of the objective truths that the biblical stories are made up out of. I mean, that doesn't rule out the objectivity of the events that occurred, but as a present person, the metaphorical truths are more useful for myself. But I do see that when you think of something as a metaphor, that gives you almost a justification to write it off as it's not a very useful metaphor. Or it's just a metaphor. It only exists within the mind of whoever's holding it. So if you let go of that, if you're a mind that lets go of that metaphor, then it no longer has any importance to you. Okay. I don't know if I brought this up, but yeah, I did. That Sam Harris brought up a good point that you need some sort of label for the objective world that exists than truth. Well, how, because Peterson's using or during that debate was only using the Darwinian version of truth, and he did come across quite more as a postmodernist in saying that there's nothing else, and that was Sam Harris's point, that you have to have some sort of external thing from the subjective truth just so that you can make the distinction between the two. And during this lecture, Peterson actually brought that up quite a bit. There's archetypally, there's the understanding that of the known and the unknown, and the objective world fits perfectly within the unknown category, because being external from the subjective understanding of it, or even the realization of it, it's technically proven as objective truths. Now, every time something that we witness happens, that puts it into not necessarily the known, because we can't control it, but it is something that arises as some sort of obstacle or problem. That kind of comes forth as the dragon of chaos, because there's something that comes out of the chaos that we have to now deal with. It's something archetypal that archetypally we must slay, and that kind of turns it into the known. So there's some sort of unknown there's something out of the objective world that is entering our psyche, or entering our physical world, that we hadn't realized or weren't able to deal with. So there's some sort of snake within the garden that we had no way of dealing with. And so to deal with it, you have to conquer that snake or that dragon, and then turn it into something that is useful for the rest of the people around you. So if you kill the dragon, then you get the virgin, or you get the treasures that you can share with the rest of the community. So this is a really interesting point that was brought up in this lecture, that I think was alluded to, but I may be extrapolating a little bit. How we as a species have been able to develop to our at least perceptually highest top of the food chain. Essentially, we're the top of the dominance hierarchy. We've been able to do that because we no longer acted within the world as it is objectively, but we've mapped out we've mapped out our previous forms of dealing with problems, say actual predators, like physical predators. We've mapped those parts of the brain to deal with how we deal with information. So when certain new information arises for us, then we deal with it in the same way that we would normally deal with a predator. So it kind of brings about a survival instinct, where there's new information. We now have to conquer this new information and use it practically for us. So it could have used to be that a lion is attacking us, we can kill the lion and then eat its meat. So now there's information that's working its way into our psyche from the unknown world, and now we have to use that information and turn it into some sort of tool that gives us life. That's why it's a tree in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that the serpent was that was kind of on top of. It's this something that we ingest that gives us life, and he brings us up later. I'll go into that. Okay. Okay, so I do think that unconsciously, perhaps, Peterson realized that he would have had to make the case that the subjective worldview was of more importance than the objective worldview, and that would be readily easable. It would have been essentially not career suicide, but at least something that he wouldn't have been able to deal with properly at that time. And so it was very wise, I think, of him to kind of fail at that debate in his in his career, because he hadn't gotten to that proper. He wasn't able to speak adequately on that subject in a way that can be taught as well as, like, say, he did in this lecture here, the Maps of Meaning number 12. I do think he comes across much easier to understand, because he does take that point from Sam Harris that there's the objective world that exists external from the psyche that works its way into the psyche. And that wasn't something that Peterson really budged on during the debate. All right. Okay, so perhaps the problem with well, I don't know if it's necessarily a problem, but pragmatism does seem correlatory with the postmodern dilemma, where if everything is subjective, then there's no way of proving that there's any objective. And through pragmatism, the only way that you can prove something is in a subjective way, which, if you're trying to prove some sort of objective reality, then that kind of works against you. I haven't thought about that quite enough, so I'm not sure if it's exactly a problem exactly yet. But let me read my notes back again. How to square off from a pragmatist point of view that our subjective perspective of reality is changed so far from the biblical times. Okay, that people are actively choosing the denial of it. Okay, that's the point I was trying to get myself to get at. Okay. As a pragmatist, the biblical stories are irrelevant, essentially, to who we are currently. And that's the modern perspective. They are an old way of thinking that did not, that was not adequate enough for what we, in our seeking out truth, these biblical stories did not function properly in that way, because we ended up finding out truths that denied the objective truths that we had gained from the Bible. Say the flat earth, for instance, or other things that we thought maybe were part of our material world that turned out not to be so. Okay. I'm sorry, this is going to be a quite the long one, and it is. As I said, if you watch the lecture first before this, then it'll be maybe more understandable, and probably a lot more useful lecture instead of listening to this. So if you're listening to this later, you can pause it, watch the lecture. Maybe then you don't have to bother listening to me. But if you're still interested, that the new pragmatic seeking out of truth, that has led us to a materialist understanding of the world, that there is no meaning within the things that we reside within. So that also comes along with it a lot of consequences for how we now derive our oughts for how to live. If there's no meaning, then you don't have to live in a specific fashion, because it's all ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme of the universe, and so you don't have to go about doing that. But so that's our new kind of subjective version of reality that we have. Now, in the case of Tolstoy, that perspective of reality was not suitable enough for him, so he had to go about finding how other people are able to live without being in nihilism. So how do people find meaning? Because you can't find it in science. So he came to religion, and then he realized how religion has so many contradictions within itself and with other religions that it cannot possibly be true. So that put him into another downspin, and so from there it's kind of a sad book because it doesn't come to an exact. It kind of ends in defeat because it's not him finding ultimate truth, it's him finding meaning by disregarding the notion that he was going to achieve ultimate truth. He had to deal with what he had within his limitations at that time. So, and make the best out of that. And so, and from that, it put him into a place where he attempted to fix the internal contradictions within, say, the Catholic Church or specific religions. So, and I guess that was kind of his goal from then on out after he finished writing the book, A Confession by Leo Tolstoy. And I do think that that's kind of where Jung went with trying to reconcile the many contradictions within every single religion. Each one cannot be ultimately true. There has to be some sort of, either they're all false, or there's some sort of archetypal truth that resides within them that is more true than any one of the individual religions that reside within it. Okay. Okay. So at 22 minutes, Peterson talks about how love is or at least touch is kind of a mammalian requirement for mice, and so otherwise they are going to die. That's a biological need that we have, and we've extrapolated that out into kind of a more abstract idea of love. I mean, you could say touch is a mammalian need, and so that's all that we need. But it's more to love than just oxytocin. It's when you touch another individual's skin. There's more to it than that your brain activates when you're around somebody that like. There's a lot more to this abstract notion that we require, that we call love, than just the sum of its parts. Now, if you were to look at all the instances where people are in love, you could root it down to the sum of its parts: oxytocin, dopamine, relationships with people that are not too agreeable, not too disagreeable with your own stances. But if you were to try to recreate that with only those small parts that you've had, I think it may ultimately fail because there might be something more. I mean, that's kind of the attempt at communism was, okay, there's this specific types of things that people require. People require money, people require food, people require community. And so it brought about an ideology to try to accomplish all of those needs. But by doing so, it created a worse situation than previous to that, to the point where people would prefer capitalism to communism just based off of people that are attempting to flee from certain communistic regimes towards more capitalistic regimes. I don't know if regime is the best, but it's applicable, I suppose, because it's finding the better solution of the two. It's not finding the best solution, because anytime you say that something is the best at something, it's also the worst at something else. So if communism is the best way at conquering inequality, which I say that's quite accurate, then it's also the worst at driving flourishing within the individuals that exist within this ideology. So it's people within communism aren't as capable as they can be outside of communism. And this is okay. This is a side topic, but there was this interview with different people that have escaped from that have defected from North Korea, and it's from this YouTube channel, Asian Boss, and he asked one of the women that had defected whether she thought that people were happier in South Korea or, from her perspective, the people in North Korea. And she had an astounding answer that I never really thought that I still don't. I still can't combat with. That she thought, from her own perspective, that the people in North Korea were happier than the people that she saw in South Korea. Even though they were starving, even though they were being under tyrannical rule, they were happy because I think it's probably because there's more. There's a kind of necessary bonding that you might have to have with the people that you suffer with. As kind of an age-old saying, misery loves company. If you have somebody that is in exactly the same boat as you, that's equality, then you're going to be um, you're going to be you're going to have more in common with that person, and so it's easy to be happy in a sense. So because of that, it's kind of put me into a place where, okay, if that's one aspect or that's one viable way of attaining happiness for a community, is happiness the best goal? I mean, it's, who can argue against being happy, right? uh, hmm. it's it's hard to argue with, but there's more to an individual's life than being happy. There's the feeling of meaning, even when you're not happy. So, say you're not as maybe naive as that North Korean defector. Maybe you don't live happily when you're in that situation, which I think is probably. It could be that she was a
You should probably get up, get ready, and feed
Uh-huh.
cats and stuff.
It could be that she was not a good analog for the whole of everyone in North Korea. Um, it could be that she was somebody that is different from most everyone else, and it could have been through naivete. Uh, but there's certain, even if you were happy in that situation, why would you attempt to leave? Because there are some certain other values that you hold besides happiness, such as the desire to live. It's probably a more. I would rather live not in complete happiness than to die happy, because there's more I can get done while I'm alive and unhappy than I can if I'm dead and not able to see anything else in the world. Okay, I'm going to have to put this on. necessarily hold, but I still have a lot more notes for this, so I think I'm going to create another video as kind of a second part, or maybe even 4 parts to this, just because I have a lot of notes that I still want to get off my chest, and it's probably for nobody that's going to be listening, but it's at least helping me in refine my own thoughts. So I'm gonna have to leave, and um, if you would like to participate in any of our conversations, we have the jordanbpeterson.community website, where you can uh, not join, but you can see our calendar of when our conversations are taking place, and you can join them during the week, and afterwards you may be able to join in these discussions that we have that are posted onto YouTube. So we have conversations that don't go up on YouTube, where we're able to formalize our thoughts in a better way, and kind of even say things where we're not entirely sure of. It's the process of thinking, where you're saying things that you don't know, and then other people are able to kind of add to that things that they know, and see where they fit and align, and get a better idea of what to do. So anyway, thank you for listening if you have, and yeah, keep sorting yourself out.